Night, excerpt number 1, Life in Siget, Transylvania, Ghetto. And then, one day, all foreign Jews were expelled from Siget, and Moishe the Beadle was a foreigner. Crammed into cattle cars by the Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon. All that was left was thick, dirty smoke. Behind me, someone said, sighing, "What do you expect? That's war." The deportees were quickly forgotten. A few days after they left, it was rumored that they were in Galicia, working, and even that they were content with their fate. Days went by, then weeks and months. Life was normal again. A calm, reassuring wind blew through our homes. The shopkeepers were doing good business, the students lived among their books, and the children played in the streets. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moishe the Beadle sitting on a bench near the entrance. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border, and once in Polish territory had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto the waiting trucks. The trucks headed toward a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they had finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. This took place in the Galician forest, near Kolomani. How had he, Moishe the Beadle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who lay dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor, who begged to die before his sons were killed. Moishe was not the same. The joy in his eyes was gone. He no longer sang. He no longer mentioned either God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen. But people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity, that he was imagining things. Others flatly said that he had gone mad. As for Moishe, he wept and pleaded, "Jews, listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity, just listen to me." He kept shouting in synagogue between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him at services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief, but all I felt was pity. "They think I am mad," he whispered, and tears like drops of wax flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, "Why do you want people to believe you so much?" "In your place, I would not care whether they believed me or not." He closed his eyes as if to escape time. "You don't understand," he said in despair. "You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. Where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Siget to describe to you my death, so that you might ready yourselves while there is still time. Life? I no longer care to live. I am alone. But I wanted to come back to warn you. Only no one is listening to me." This was toward the end of 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal once again. London radio, which we listened to every evening, announced encouraging news. The daily bombings of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation of the Second Front. And so we, the Jews of Siget, waited for better days that surely were to come. I continued to devote myself to my studies, Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business and the community. My grandfather came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so as to attend the services of the celebrated Rebbe of Borsch. My mother was beginning to think it was high time to find an appropriate match for Hilda. Thus passed the year of 1943. Spring 1944. Splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt. Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months, weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others, with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, its births. The people were saying, "The Red Army is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us, even if he wants to." Yes, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Annihilate an entire people? Wipe out a population dispersed throughout so many nations? So many millions of people? By what means? In the middle of the 20th century? And thus my elders concerned themselves with all manner of things: strategy, diplomacy, politics, Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moishe the beetle had fallen silent. He was weary of talking. He would drift through synagogue or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. In those days it was still possible to buy immigration certificates to Palestine. I had asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. "I am too old, my son," he answered. "Too old to start a new life, too old to start from scratch in some distant land." Budapest radio announced that the fascist party had seized power. The regent Miklos Horthy was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi Nationalist Party to form a new government. Yet we were still not worried. Of course, we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change of ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Mordechai Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us, "The Jews of Budapest live in the atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti-Semitic acts take place every day, in the streets, on the trains. The fascists attack Jewish stores and synagogues. The situation has become very serious." The news spread through Saget like wildfire. Soon that was all people talked about. But not for long. Optimism soon revived. "The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest for strategic reasons, for political reasons." In less than 3 days, German army vehicles made their appearance on our streets. Anguish. German soldiers with their steel helmets and their death head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted in private homes, even in Jewish homes. Their attitude towards their hosts was distant, but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us. We were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, and polite. 3 days after he moved in, he brought Mrs. Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. "Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us. There they are, your Germans. What do you say now? Where is their famous cruelty?" The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power. The verdict was already out, and the Jews of Saget were still smiling. The 8 days of Passover. The weather was sublime. My mother was busy in the kitchen. The synagogues were no longer open. People gathered in private homes. No need to provoke the Germans. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice during the 8 days of celebration. But our hearts were not in it. We wished the holiday would end so as to not have to pretend. On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment on, everything happened very quickly. The race toward death had begun. First edict: Jews were prohibited from leaving their residences for 3 days, under penalty of death. Moishe the beetle came running to our house. "I warned you," he shouted, and left without waiting for a response. The same day, the Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities, under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. As for my mother, she went on tending to the many chores in the house. Sometimes she would stop and gaze at us in silence. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star. Some prominent members of the community came to consult with my father, who had connections at the upper levels of the Hungarian police. They wanted to know what he thought of the situation. My father's view was that it was not all bleak, or perhaps he just did not want to discourage the others, to throw salt on their wounds. The yellow star? So what? It's not lethal. Poor father, of what then did you die? But new edicts were already being issued. We no longer had the right to frequent restaurants or cafes, to travel by rail, to attend synagogue, to be on the streets after 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came the ghettos. 2 ghettos were created in Siget. A large one in the center of town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended out several alleyways on the outskirts of town. The street we lived on, Serpent Street, was in the first ghetto. We therefore could remain in our house, but as it occupied a corner, the windows facing the street outside of the ghetto had to be sealed. We gave some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their homes. Little by little, life returned to normal. The barbed wire that encircled us like a wall did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt this was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves. A small Jewish republic, a Jewish council was appointed, as well as a Jewish police force, a welfare agency, a labor committee, a health agency, a whole governmental apparatus. People thought this was a good thing. We could no longer have to look at all those hostile faces, endure those hate-filled stares. No more fear, no more anguish. We would live among Jews, among brothers. Of course, there still was unpleasant moments. Every day the Germans came looking for men to load coal into the military trains. Volunteers for this kind of work were few. But apart from that, the atmosphere was oddly peaceful and reassuring. Most people thought that we would remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army. Afterward, everything would be as before. The ghetto was ruled by neither German nor Jew. It was ruled by delusion. Some 2 weeks before Shavuot, a sunny spring day, people strolled seamlessly carefree through the crowded streets. They exchanged cheerful greetings. Children played games, rolling hazelnuts on the sidewalk. Some schoolmates and I were in Ezra Malik's garden studying a Talmudic treatise. Night fell. Some 20 people had gathered in our courtyard. My father was sharing some anecdotes and holding forth on his opinion of the situation. He was a good storyteller. Suddenly the gate opened, and Stern, a former shopkeeper who now was a policeman, entered and took my father aside. Despite the growing darkness, I could see my father turn pale. "What's wrong?" we asked. "I don't know. I have been summoned to a special meeting of the council. Something must have happened." The story he had interrupted would remain unfinished. "I'm going right now," he said. "I'll return as soon as possible. I'll tell you everything. Wait for me." We were ready to wait as long as necessary. The courtyard turned into something like an antechamber to an operating room. We stood waiting for the door to open. Neighbors, hearing the rumors, had joined us. We stared at our watches. Time had slowed down. What was the meaning of such a long session? "I have a bad feeling," said my mother. "This afternoon I saw new faces in the ghetto. 2 German officers. I believe they were Gestapo. Since we've been here we have not seen a single officer." It was close to midnight. Nobody felt like going to sleep, though some people briefly went to check on their homes. Others left but asked to be called as soon as my father returned. At last the door opened and he appeared. His face was drained of color. He was quickly surrounded. Tell us what's happening. Say something." At that moment we were so anxious to hear something encouraging, a few words telling us that was nothing to worry about, that the meeting had been routine, just a review of welfare and health problems. But one glance at my father's face left no doubt. "The news is terrible," he said at last, and then one word: transports. The ghetto was to be liquidated entirely. Departures were to take place street by street, starting the next day. We wanted to know everything, every detail. We were stunned, yet we wanted to fully absorb the bitter news. Where will they take us? That was a secret. a secret for all except one, the president of the Jewish Council. But he could not tell, or could not tell. The Gestapo had threatened to shoot him if he talked. "There are rumors," my father said, his voice breaking, "that we are being taken somewhere in Hungary to work for the brick factories. It seems that here we are too close to the front." After a moment's silence, he added, "Each of us will be allowed to bring a personal belongings, a backpack, some food, a few items of clothing, nothing else." Again, heavy silence. "Go and wake the neighbors," said my father. "They must get ready." The shadows around me roused themselves as if from a deep sleep, and left silently in every direction. For a moment we remained alone. Suddenly Batia Rake, a relative who lived with us, entered the room. "Someone is knocking at the sealed window, the one that faces outside." It was only after the war that I found out that one who knocked that night. It was the inspector of the Hungarian police, a friend of my father's. Before we entered the ghetto he had told us, "Don't worry, I'll warn you if there is danger." Had he been able to speak to us that night, we might have been able to flee, but by the time we succeeded in opening the window, it was too late. There was nobody outside.